Okay, afternoon. Our next speaker is an economist, author, and political commentator. He has authored several books, including Bias Against Gun, Freedomonomics, More Guns, Less Crime, and soon-to-be-released Debacle, Obama's War Against Jobs and Growth. He is best known for the impact he has had with his book, More Guns, Less Crime, to the gun rights debate. And here to discuss the topic of do gun-free zones make people safer, I am pleased to welcome Dr. John Lott.
Well, we greatly appreciate you guys inviting me to come here today. Gave me an excuse to go and do a talk up at Dartmouth and see my son up there, so it was nice. But anyway, so I was asked to give a talk on gun-free zones, and what I'd like you to think about, I don't really want to answer right now, but can you name me one place, doesn't have to be in the United States, it can be any place else in the world, where we have a gun ban and we've seen murder rates fall? I can't find it. You know, some place where we have crime data both before and after the ban goes into effect, where you can actually see that the ban or instituting some type of gun-free zone caused murder rates and violent crime rates to fall. So I can't find it. Now, Americans have had a fair amount of experience with gun-free zones. I suppose the most topical examples of that were with D.C. and Chicago, cases that the Supreme Court recently looked into. And my guess is a lot of you probably have some familiarity with what happened to crime rates in D.C. and Chicago, how they went up, murder rates and violent crime rates went up in both places after the ban. You may have a lot less familiarity with what's happened to crime rates there since the Supreme Court struck down the gun laws in those two places. In D.C. it was the handgun ban and gun locks, and in Chicago it was the gun ban. Now, a lot of gun control proponents, if we push them on this, they'll go and say, well, those really weren't fair tests. That unless you go and you ban guns every place, you can't really expect to see drops in violent crime and murder. I suppose I have a few responses to that. One is that they'll say, well, you can go and get guns from Maryland and Virginia or Pennsylvania if you're in D.C., or you can get guns from the rest of Illinois, or you can get them from Indiana or Wisconsin or Michigan. The problem is that clearly they could have gotten the guns from those places to begin with. It's not really clear why the gun ban then, based on their logic, should see increases in murder rates and violent crimes. They may explain why you don't see a drop. In addition, if they really didn't think that it was a fair test, that they thought it was going to fail, then it would have been nice if they kind of shared that with everybody before they went and pushed for the law. And I suppose a final point to bring up is that well, we just don't have to look at those bans in D.C. and Chicago. We look around the world where entire countries have passed gun bans. Indeed, something that we'll look at data for, you can look at island nations that have passed gun bans over the entire nation, where you just can't blame some neighbor nearby for supplying guns that's there. And yet you still see, as we'll see, increases in murders and violent crimes after those bans went into effect. Now, there are many other areas where you have gun bans in American life, gun-free zones. I've been involved with some of these debates over time. But one area that I've been involved with the pilots unions after 9/11, where different pilots union groups tried to lobby to be able to go and carry guns on planes with them. And one thing that's kind of emphasized for me again is something that I see continually time after time in these types of debates, is people kind of assume that whatever laws are in place right now are the way laws have always been. And the debate over gun control often involves hypothetical things about what might possibly go wrong. So in the case of pilots, it would be, Well, what happens if the pilots get into an argument and one pilot pulls out a gun and the other pilot pulls out a gun and the two pilots shoot each other in the plane? What are you going to do then? Or what happens if pilots accidentally discharge their gun and you get a hole in the side of the fuselage? People guess watch too many James Bond movies and think there's going to be explosive depressurization of the plane. It doesn't happen. There are lots of little holes already throughout the airplane. One more hole isn't even going to be noticeable. And, but the thing is, we actually don't have to just debate these things in terms of hypotheticals, because laws have changed over time. And one thing a lot of Americans may not realize is that between 1924 and 1963, all commercial airline pilots in the United States were mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them whenever they flew. Basically, this had happened in the 1920s when you started having biplanes going around carrying mail to the post office. They were worried that if a biplane were to go and crash into a cornfield someplace, you wanted to make sure that the pilot was armed so that he could go and keep the mail from being stolen that was there in case somebody tried to steal the mail. And so that regulation went into effect, and it basically stayed in effect there for 4 decades. Even after the end of 1963, when the mandatory requirement was eliminated, pilots were still allowed to go and carry handguns with them up until the end of 1979, when Jimmy Carter forbid pilots from carrying guns in. But the thing is, rather than just looking at hypotheticals and playing hypotheticals, you can go look at the record. And in fact, despite all those 50 years of pilots being able to or mandated to carry guns on planes and the millions of flights with which that occurred, you cannot find one single instance where something bad happened with a pilot being able to carry a gun on a plane. There are, in fact, actually a number of cases where pilots with guns actually stop crimes that they probably couldn't have stopped otherwise. And if anybody's an old movie buff from the 1950s, there's actually more than a few movies that kind of have some part of the plot dealing with one of the pilots carrying guns on planes stopping a crime. Another example, I don't know if anybody's ever read Antonin Scalia's autobiography or read the biography for Colin Powell. There are 2 guys who grew up in New York City, and both of them were on riflery teams in high school. And as much as it may be hard for a lot of New Yorkers to believe, you have a situation where on any given day, you could have maybe 4 or 5, 6, 7, even 8,000 high school kids from ages 14 to 18 walking around on the streets of New York City, carrying their rifles, walking, being on subways, on buses, and taxi cabs. Just any given school day, just having thousands of kids walking around New York City carrying rifles. They would take the guns to school, drop them in the back of the homeroom unlocked during the morning, come back later in the afternoon when school was let out, pick up their rifles, go to the riflery range, shoot, and then walk home or go on subways and buses to take their guns home because they weren't stored at school. And again, you can go and look and try to see if there are problems, but I haven't been able to find one, and nobody that I've debated or talked to has been able to point to a single example of a problem with all these rifles being carted around by teenagers on New York City streets. So, but I'm sure if you go and tell a lot of New Yorkers that was happening up until 1969, they'd think you were crazy. So, we can go and we'll talk about other countries a little bit more. So, I thought, I used to work for a prior when I was chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington. Steve wrote a dissent in the Heller case, the one that struck down the D.C. gun ban and gun laws. And I think he pretty much summarizes what a lot of gun control proponents believe pretty succinctly. Breyer wrote in his dissent that was joined by 3 other justices, he said, quote, if a resident has a handgun in the home that he can use for self-defense, then he's a handgun in the home that he can use to commit suicide or engage in acts of domestic violence. If it is indeed the case, as the district believes, that the number of guns contributes to the number of gun-related crimes, accidents, and deaths, And although there may be less restrictive, less effective substitutes for an outright ban, there's no less restrictive equivalent of an outright ban. And you can, if you read his dissent, Breyer didn't believe that there was a right to self-defense. And, but he said that even if there was a right to self-defense, he thought that that would be overridden by the public interest in public safety, either in terms of reducing gun crimes or suicides by banning guns. And you can get some idea of just how important this public policy issue was to his determination on whether or not gun bans should be allowed, just by looking at some words in his 44-page dissent. If you look at just the words crime, criminal, criminologist, homicide, murder, rape, and victim, those words alone were used 109 times in 44 pages. The term suicide was mentioned an additional 13 times. And so, if you just look at those words, on average they were used 3 times a page for those 44 pages. It gives you a pretty good idea of how important that one issue was. Now, all sorts of people were predicting disaster after the Supreme Court struck down either the D.C. or Chicago gun bans. And I can give you lots and lots of pages of quotes on this from gun control groups. I mean, one can just look at the briefs that they filed in the Supreme Court cases, or different politicians like Chuck Schumer or Dianne Feinstein or others. I'm just going to show you 2 quotes here from the mayors of D.C. and Chicago. Mayor Fenty, who was the mayor of D.C. at the time of the Heller decision, said, "More handguns in the District of Columbia will only lead to more gun violence." And Mayor Richard Daley predicted blood in the streets and said, we would, quote, "go back to the Old West, you have a gun, I have a gun, and we'll settle it in the streets." Pretty strong predictions about the disaster that was going to befall those cities after the Supreme Court decision. Now, I'm going to go and show you some data for D.C. and Chicago, which is a tiny bit of background first. The D.C. gun ban and gun law was passed in August '76. There was a court injunction that kept it from going into effect up until February '77. And there are different ways that we can go, and just so you know, it basically made it not only a crime to go and have a handgun, but it made it a felony for people to actually chamber a bullet, and even a long gun, a rifle or shotgun within the district. And it's a mandatory 5-year minimum prison sentence that was there. So it made it a felony for somebody to use even a long gun defensively. And I personally think that may have had a bigger impact on crime changes afterwards than the handgun changes. But there are different ways you can look at the crime data. Probably the simplest is just to see, well, what happened to murder rates and violent crime rates after the Supreme Court decision there, or after the ban went into effect. And what you'll see is that there's only 1 year after the D.C. gun ban went into effect where D.C.'s murder rate was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. It was 1984. And you can compare it also to other cities. If you look at the top 50 cities in the United States, and just look at where D.C. ranks relative to those cities, prior to the ban, D.C. would rank someplace around 15th to 23rd. After the ban went into effect, 30 years was in effect, D.C. would rank either number 1 or number 2 50% of the time. It would rank in the top 4 2/3 of the time. There's no time prior to the ban where D.C.'s rank was even remotely similar to that. So there's another way we can look at this too, and that is we can just look at the ratio of D.C.'s murder rate to the murder rate in the other 50 largest cities, just the ratio of those. I exclude Chicago because Chicago also had a gun ban. But basically, you can see here that DC's murder rate was generally falling prior to the ban. It increased. I always show you 13 years right now. You'll see why in a minute. But basically, it's about 40%, 60% higher. At the end, it's about 80% higher. You can see if you get past the very end of the 80s there's a huge increase in DC's murder rate relative to other cities. So even here, I mean, one reason for excluding this to begin with is that there are large changes here, but just the scale has shrunk so much when you end up having these huge changes here. Hard to see the big increases that you had previously had. And, you know, basically there's a crack cocaine epidemic that hits around 89. It's something that affected cities across the country. It seemed to have a much bigger impact in DC than it did other cities, whether that was in part due to the fact that people were less able to defend themselves when problems would arise is something that we can talk about. But one thing is clear, the crack cocaine epidemic problem was basically over like 4 or 5 years, and yet even after that, DC's murder rate remained very high relative to the ratio of the other cities that were there. And you can look at it broken down other ways, DC relative to Maryland and Virginia, DC relative to, you know, farther out, it's relative to the US as a whole, and again, very similar pattern. So what's happened since the Heller decision in 2008? There's been a huge drop in violent crimes, and it's been amazing how little coverage this has gotten. If you look at murders in DC, compare 2008 to 2009, 2009 had a 23% drop. It goes from about 186 to 144. That brings it down to a rate of 23.5 per 100,000 people. And DC's murder rate continued to fall after that. It fell by 8.4% in 2010, 22% in 2011. Now nationally, we've been having a drop in murder rates, 7.3% in 2009, so that's about a third the drop that we saw in DC, 4% in 2010, 5.7% in 2011, so that's about a quarter of the drop that you saw in DC for that year. And now, one of the things is, obviously, if you compare 2008 to 2009, there's a little bit of a problem with that because obviously the ban was only in effect for part of the year. It was in effect for all the year. So we want to try to compare apples to apples here. The ban was struck down in the end of June. It took about a month for DC to enact new gun control laws there. So if you just take the first 7 months of the year and look at 07, 08, 09, 2010, 2011, you can see that homicides in 07 were 104, 107 in 08, fell to 82 in 09, fell to 70 in 2010, and 62 in 2011. That's a 42% drop over those 3 years in murders. You know, you can only imagine if murders had suddenly soared by 42% after the ban had gone into effect, what type of news coverage you'd be getting. But you can go and do news searches on the Washington Post or look at other places, and you're not going to see any discussion linking that, you know, they'll mention the big drop in crime, but they won't mention any linkage of that to the change in the gun control law. Now, a couple points I make. You know, we've only had a couple thousand people register handguns since then. As I said, I think the big thing there was making so it's no longer a felony for people who use guns defensively. If you actually ever read the oral arguments in the Heller case, there's kind of an amusing discussion between Roberts and some of the lawyers on both sides about, you know, hypothetical him reading in bed and hearing somebody breaking in and trying to undo his gun lock, asking how hard it would be to do that. We actually lucked out on that because Alan Gura refused to answer the questions, basically, from Justice Roberts. The other side said gun locks wouldn't impede anybody being able to use a gun. But the Supreme Court justices basically said, they said, look, we commit that you own a gun, but if it's a crime for you to go and actually use it, it pretty much negates you being able to use guns defensively. And can I help you?
Oh, no, I just
so anyway, they struck down DC's gun law provisions. And the thing is, you had it so that about 72,000 people, adults in the District of Columbia, actually had licenses and registration for long guns. It's about a third of the adult population. So a lot of individuals there who previously would have been a felony for them to go and use a gun defensively are now able to go and do that. Now there's some other changes that we have here for the crime rates. I just mentioned one. I mean, not only do we have violent crime rates fall in general, but you can see here if you look at crimes with guns and crimes without guns, that there's a bigger drop in crimes with guns than crimes without guns. For robbery without guns, it fell by 34%. Robberies with guns fell by 58%. Aggravated assaults without guns fell by 11%. Aggravated assaults with guns fell by 36%. And that's consistent with other things that people have shown over time that, if you look at right to carry laws, research that's been done indicates that not only do you see drops in violent crimes, but you see larger drops in gun crimes than you see in non-gun crimes. And basically, riskier, more costly, that something could go wrong if both sides are carrying guns. It's true for the criminal too. And a lot of them just stop carrying guns at that point. So now we can look at Chicago. Chicago's gun ban went into effect in November '82. It passed earlier in the year, but you had another injunction, just like in DC's case. And if you just look at Chicago's murder rate over time, there's no year after the ban went into effect that the murder rate was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. And here I just show you similar graphs to what I've shown you before, and that is if you look at this Chicago relative to the 9 largest cities, again the data starts at 74. You can see Chicago's murder rate was about 70% higher than the rate in other cities, falling to about 5% below. It's a fairly large fall consistently over time here. When the ban went into effect in late '82, it stops falling and generally starts to increase after that point in time. And you can see again, if we break it down for the other 50 largest cities, similar pattern. And you can look at it for the 5 counties that border Chicago, 4 in Illinois, and 1 in Indiana. Obviously, these more suburban counties have higher murder rates than Chicago had, but their murder rates are falling, fairly large drop. What's even more dramatic is the increase afterwards. Now, not all Illinois counties reported all the crime numbers in '84, so it was missing. But you can see a huge increase. Very large increase that starts, stops falling and starts to rise as soon as the ban goes into effect there. And you can see for relative to the U.S. as a whole. Now we don't have as much data right now for Chicago, but you can see if you just look at murders, and they changed their law very quickly after the Supreme Court decision in June 2010. So again, if you just compare the first 6 months of 2010 to the first 6 months of 2011, murder rates have fallen by 14%. Again, pretty much a drop in violent crime rates across the board. And there's a slightly different way that we can break this down with looking at because we have like the last 6 months of 2009 or the last end of year period with the ban. You compare that to the last 6 months of 2010, right after the change had occurred. This is about a 14% drop. Again, it's about a 14% drop, as we noted there. So, immediately you're seeing a drop in murder rates relative to the previous years. And just a graph there. Oak Park, Illinois was also affected by the change, and you saw a drop in violent crimes there. And as I mentioned, this is something that we observe internationally, this pattern. It's not just in the United States. Few countries that have had gun bans that are island nations. I'll just show you those right now. Ireland had its gun ban go into effect in the beginning of '72. Its murder rates bouncing around. Prior to this, when the ban goes into effect, big increases in murder. Even if you kind of drop off the more extreme times, it's much higher here. Now it's true you have drug gang problems that were occurring in the end of the 90s and this last decade. I guess what I would just point out at this point, is that just the Republic of Ireland? It's a country. Yeah, it's not Northern Ireland. So, you know, there's drug gang problems that are there towards the end of the period. But one thing is for sure is that the gun ban didn't stop the drug gangs from getting hold of guns. And this is for Jamaica. Jamaica's law changed in I don't know what happened to the days here. This is the 60s, this is the early 70s. The change occurred here in 75. And you can see there's big increases in murder rates that occurred. Again, you have some political violence here, and you have political violence and drug gang issues that are occurring. Again, guns bans doesn't seem to stop those from occurring. There's a huge increase that we see taking place over time here. Now, one thing just to mention here a little bit is just talk about the drug issue, because it is very closely tied to homicide rates. And that is, drug gangs have something very valuable. They have drugs. And just as they can go and bring in these illegal drugs, we know how hard the government's tried over time in order to try to stop the importation of illegal drugs. It's just as easy for them to bring in the weapons that they have to go and protect these things. It's not like they can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs. You help us get it back. Or that some other gang is trying to, move into their turf and trying to take over their area. They can't go to the police for help, so they set up their own military. And when they have something as very valuable as drugs there, they're going to have to find some way to go and protect it. And, I don't know, do people know what year had the highest murder rate in U.S. history? 1932 was the last year Prohibition, the highest murder rate we had in the United States. Within 2 years after the end of Prohibition, murder rates had fallen by about 60% in the United States and basically stayed low until you got to the mid-60s. And and we could go into a very long discussion here about how concentrated murders are in a very small number of areas. Basically, 77% of the county year observations that you have between the mid-70s and now have 0 murders. And so you have about 75% of the murders take place in about 3% of the counties in the United States. And if you've ever lived in a major city like New York or DC or Chicago or LA or some other major city, once a year or so there'll be a map in the major newspapers there to just show you the distribution of murders. And they're not distributed evenly across the place. They're usually very heavily concentrated in a few areas within those areas, and that's basically a lot of drug gang activity, either directly or indirectly. Now, another place that had a ban, this was in handguns. This is for England and Wales. Their handgun ban went into effect in January '97. There were about 55,000 people who had registered handguns beforehand. But you can see it's pretty hard to go and see any immediate evidence of any drop in murder rates. By the end of this period, it comes down still slightly higher than it was at the beginning, but on average, it's about 28% higher than it was before. Okay, so here we have a problem, and the question is, we see this time after time. You at least expect a few times, just out of randomness, to see murder rates going down, but they seem to consistently go up. And so what's the deal here? Why are they going up? Why aren't they going down? is those who are pushing for gun control would claim we should be seeing. And I think there's a very simple answer to that, and that is when you pass a ban, or any type of gun control law generally, the question you have to ask yourself is who's most likely to obey the law? And if it turns out that it's most law-abiding citizens who turn in their guns and disarm relative to criminals, then the question that we face is that are you actually going to make it harder or easier for criminals to go and commit crimes? I suppose the way to think about this most is, let's say a violent criminal was seriously stalking you or your family. Was actually posing a real danger. Would you feel safer putting a sign up in front of your home that said this home is a gun-free zone? Would that make you feel safer putting that up? Do you think that would deter the criminal from coming in or not? My guess is, if you think about it, it's probably not the best use of your time. That what you're doing is, at the very least, is you may be actually encouraging the criminal to go and attack you there. That type of sign can serve as a magnet for those types of attacks, because what you're telling him is he has less to worry about if he decides to go and attack you there as opposed to someplace else.
Isn't that also similar to putting up a sign for a person in a certain political party who's a renowned anti-gun person? Like a campaign sign in your lawn? If I were a criminal, I'd find it, seek out those people and not them.
Well, I mean, not all Democrats. I mean, you still get like about 30% of Democrats on that. So maybe lower than 55% or so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hypocrisy amongst the anti-gunners anyways. A lot of them own guns, even though
I mean, you just have David Brock's story that had a Media Matters. Turns out he was having one of his employees carry around guns with him, protect them in D.C. That was a felony to do it. And Media Matters is probably the one group that's most viciously and most publicly attacking gun ownership. It's like 2.5 times a week they average attacks on the NRA, stories on the NRA, and virtually every day they have a story saying that people shouldn't own guns. And yet, here the head of it has armed bodyguards, either guarding his house or guarding him while he's walking around D.C., even though it was a felony for him to do it. So I'm just saying, who knows about that. But now, there's some other work here. Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I looked at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999, and when I was in Chicago. And there are a couple of interesting things that we found. We tried to account for literally hundreds of different factors that can affect multiple victim public shootings, things like income, poverty, demographics, many different types of law enforcement activity, as well as lots of 13 different types of gun control laws. And what we found, for example, is that law enforcement, while it's extremely important in going and reducing violent crime generally, police are probably the single most important factor, I think. One of the things that we found is that law enforcement didn't seem to have any statistically significant impact on multiple victim public shootings. And there's actually a pretty simple reason for that when you think about it, and that is, how does law enforcement work? Law enforcement works by punishing people after the fact. And what we find is in about 3/4 of these multiple victim public shootings, the shooters themselves die at the scene. And in the other quarter, interviews that are done with these guys afterwards, you find that most of them, or basically all of them, expected to die. They just couldn't bring themselves to commit suicide. And so if you believe that it's virtually certain that you're going to die in one of these attacks, it's not too much of a surprise then to find that changes in arrest rates or conviction rates or probabilities of death penalty or other things aren't going to have a very statistically significant impact on the behavior of these individuals beforehand. We also looked at different types of gun control laws. We looked at assault weapons bans, one gun a month purchases, waiting period, background checks, gun show regulations. None of those seem to have any impact on multiple victim public shootings. The one law that we found that had an impact on multiple victim public shootings was the passage of right to carry laws. And when states pass these laws, there's about a 60% drop in the rate at which these attacks occur, and about a 78% drop in the rate at which people are killed or injured from these attacks. And to the extent to which attacks still occur, they overwhelmingly took place in the few gun-free zones that were available in the state. Now, one thing that's interesting, another puzzle kind of here, is if you look at the impact of right to carry laws on murder or violent crime generally, it's much smaller than it is for these multiple victim shootings. So for each additional year that right to carry laws in effect, you see about a 1.5% drop in murder. So why is it so much bigger? Why do you have a 60% drop for these types of multiple victim shootings, but just a 1.5% drop per year for these for murders generally? And again, there turns out to be a very simple explanation for it. I don't know, we have maybe 50 people here or so, 60 in the room. You know, compare that to a woman late at night in a dark parking lot. You know, someplace like Pennsylvania, you have like 6.5% of the adult population with permits. That represents some risk to the attack and some deterrence. But if we have 50 people here in the room, and even if there's a 5% chance that any one individual would have a permanent concealed handgun, and even, you know, let's assume that the probability is independent. I'm sure at a meeting like this it would not be independent. But if we assume that they were, then you have still have a probability of 100%, basically, that someone in this room, someone who would be unknown to an attacker, who might come bursting through the doors here, would be able to defend themselves and defend others. And one of the things that you clearly see here is that as the probability that someone's able to go and defend themselves increases, you see greater deterrence that arises there. Just mention one point, maybe I should have mentioned this earlier about who obeys gun-free zones. But, you know, you take something like the Virginia Tech attack in which 32 people were killed. You know, if you're a professor who lives in Virginia or a student who's over 21 and you have a permit to carry a concealed handgun legally, you're able to carry your permanent concealed handgun virtually any place in the state. There are literally only a few places in the state where you're not allowed to go and carry your permanent concealed handgun. Courts, airports, K through 12 schools, universities. And, but if you were, let's say you're a professor, and you accidentally carry your permanent concealed handgun onto university property, what's going to happen if you get caught? You're going to get fired. What do you think is going to happen to your academic career if you get fired for a firearms-related violation on university property there? Your chances of going and getting hired by another university in the United States is about as close to zero as you can get. And you face similar penalties if you're a student. If you're somebody who's in law school or an undergraduate or working on your MBA, even though you're legally able to go and carry the gun virtually any place in the state, if you go and carry it on university property, you get caught. You can get expelled. And to have it on your record that you got expelled for a firearms-related violation, again, it may not be quite as close to zero as it would be for a professor trying to get a job at another place, but it's going to be pretty darn close. And you know, those are real penalties for those individuals. You know, if you're a student, to go and say you can't get your law degree, you can't go and get an undergraduate degree, your life is going to be unalterably changed in very major ways if that's going to be the outcome. Whereas this killer in this situation, who's killed 32 people, if he's already facing, let's say, 32 life sentences or 32 death penalties, the notion that somehow the penalty that would have kept him from committing this crime would be the threat of being expelled from school, in addition to 32 death penalties, is not a serious thing to even talk about. You know, it's absurd that somebody would think that that would be the case. And so when you have those types of penalties, who do they often be more likely to have obeyed the law. What you're going to find is that it's basically the more law-abiding citizens again who are going to obey these laws relative to the criminals because they face a higher real penalty. You know, I suppose somebody could go and argue that the kid telling his parents that, assuming he lived, he died in this case, as they almost always do, you know, that he faces 32 death penalties, but he can't bring himself to tell his parents that he's also been expelled. Just isn't very credible. So, now there's other things we can talk about here. Israel provides a lot of interesting examples. I'm sure a lot of you have some rough idea on the terrorist attacks in Israel over time. You know, from before the country started, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and so on. There are a couple of interesting things to point out here. One is, if you look at the terrorist attacks during the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the very early 70s, they're virtually all involved machine guns. After the early 70s, virtually all the terrorist attacks involved bombs. Now, there wasn't any change in technology. You know, there may be some technological changes one could talk about during the 1980s, but there really wasn't any change that occurred earlier. And and so the question is, what changed? Does anybody know what changed in Israel during the early 70s? Yeah, you know. Anybody else know what happened? Yeah.
People started carrying firearms.
Right, they started letting civilians go and carry handguns there. And because what had happened was, Israel for a long time would go and say, well, we have more terrorist attacks, let's just try to put more police, more military on the street. You know, if we just spend more money, we could go and cover more areas. The problem that they face is that terrorists have huge strategic advantages in this case. And the huge strategic advantage is that, let's say you're a terrorist on a bus and 2 police officers are there. What do? You got at least 2 options. One option is to simply wait until the officers leave and then go and engage in your attack. The second option that you have is to go and kill them first before you go and start killing other people on the bus. And what Israel discovered is that no matter how many officers they put out there, no matter how many military they put out there on the streets, that if a terrorist is willing to be patient enough and just wait around, there's some opening that's going to provide him with a chance to go and do some real harm in terms of an attack. Now, so the big thing that changed was when they started letting civilians go and carry these handguns. And it got as high as about 15% of the Jewish population were allowed to do that. You end up with a situation where the reason for the change is that if I pull out a machine gun, you give people a chance to respond. You set off a bomb, there's really not a whole, that's suicide bomb. There's not a whole hell of a lot to respond to after the bomb's gone off. Now, there are a number of cases I go through in my books, The Bias Against Guns, and other places. They go and illustrate, cases where bombing attacks were stopped by citizens with concealed handguns. But there's one story that I have in More Guns, Less Crime, a newspaper story that I quote from soon after the rules changed there. There was a terrorist attack by 4 terrorists with machine guns in a mall in suburban Tel Aviv. In a suburb around Tel Aviv, in which they went into a mall, pulled out their machine guns. It was kind of early in the afternoon on a school day, and started firing. The people in the mall pulled out their handguns, fired back. 3 of the terrorists were killed. The 4th one was seriously wounded. But the interesting thing about the story was that you had the attendant in the ambulance that was taking the 4th terrorist to the hospital, rushing to the hospital, remarked about how incredibly upset the terrorist was because nobody had told him that the old ladies, middle-aged women or older who were in the mall at that time would have handguns and pulling them out. So I felt very upset that nobody told him. So anyway, when these types of attacks occur, because of the books More Guns, Less Crime or Bias Against Guns, I get calls from media around the world. After the Virginia Tech attack, I must have gotten calls from 40 or so media from around the world, I guess. And often when I get these types of calls, the questions I get involve something like, what is it about you Americans? You know, is it something in water? Is it something in your love affair for guns? And you have all these multiple victim public shootings that are occurring in the United States. And right at the time of the Virginia Tech attack, I decided to go and change how I answered these questions. And so I remember right after the attack, I got a call from somebody, a German newspaper outlet, and they were asking me, you know, what is it that's weird about you Americans that causes you to have all these horrible attacks? And what I asked him, I said to this German, can you tell me which country in the world has had the 2 worst K through 12 public school shootings? I couldn't answer. And I said, well, Germany. And in fact, Germany has 3 of the worst 5 K through 12 public school shootings. In fact, all 3 of those have occurred within the last decade. And so we kind of went on to other topics at that point. But the point was, you know, when you have Columbine in the United States, in which horribly 13 people were killed, that got months of coverage in Europe. Obviously, it was talked about for years here in the United States. When you have 18 people killed in a public school shooting in Germany, it may get very brief mention for part of one day in the United States. Doesn't mean you get huge coverage across all of Europe. And in fact, when you look at multiple victim public shootings across Europe, it's very similar per capita rate to what it is in the United States. That, you know, without even trying, I can give you lots of examples. About a year and a half ago, you had 10 people killed at a university in Finland. You had 10 people killed at a mall. About a year and a half ago, you had 10 people killed by a taxi cab driver in the UK. Of course, last year you had 70-some people killed in Norway by guns, and more was killed by bombs. And you know, you look at Switzerland had a couple big attacks in the last decade. They had 14 people killed in a parliamentary canton of Zug, 14 members of parliament. Up until 1999, there were no gun-free zones in Switzerland, but there was a constitutional amendment that passed. And and so individual cantons were allowed to designate gun-free zones and put other types of regulations, and some of them did. And this is one of the places where it became a gun-free zone. Another place is a few years after that, where you had 10 people killed in another government building. France very frequently has multiple victim public shootings. So I can go through a long list there. Most people don't appreciate how many there are there. So I'm gonna, I'll just mention one other thing. I'll just skip to the behavior permit holders. What you find is that they're incredibly law-abiding. Permit holders lose their permits for any firearms-related violation at hundreds or thousands of 1 percentage point. If you want to look up some data on More Guns Less Crime, I have data for 25 different states, detailed data for it, but one place that's easy for you to look at on your own. Florida, if you just Google Florida concealed carry statistics, one of the top couple links will be for the state's licensing website. And what you'll find is that between October '87 and July of last year, over 2 million people have gotten permits. Average person had their permits for about 13 years. With all those millions of people and all those years that they had permits, you'll find 168 had their permits revoked for any type of firearms-related violation. It's about 1/100 of 1%. If you look at the data over just the last 4 years, you find that the revocation, there are 4 revoked. With about 840,000 permit holders, that comes to an annual revocation rate of 0.0002%. 2/10,000 of 1%. I would argue it's pretty hard to think of any other group that has this low of violation record as that does. Now, just in summary, there's 2 groups of people who seem to benefit the most from having guns. Basically, poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas, people most likely to be victims of violent crime, and also people who are relatively weaker physically. Women and the elderly benefit much more than middle-aged or younger males do from having guns. You're talking about male criminals doing the attacking, and when you have a male criminal attacking a female victim or an elderly person, there's a larger strength differential that exists there, and a lot bigger return for somebody having a gun in that situation. Well, I appreciate you having me here. I that, and I'm happy to answer maybe one or two fast questions. I probably went a little bit long. But I also have copies of 4 or 5 of my books here, if people are interested. Yeah.
The Brady Bill created the National Instant Check System. Is there any way to tell the effect of that system since it's national?
Well, my books, both the More Guns, Less Crime, the 3rd edition, and Advice Against Guns go through that in detail. You can look at both it being instituted, you can look at state waiting periods, and I don't know of any study by a criminologist or economist that finds that background checks reduce any type of violent crime rate. When it was first instituted and you had a waiting period, it actually seemed to have a pernicious effect on rape rates by a small amount. But I had very detailed discussions about this. Yeah.
Any plans for a Freedonomics Part 2?
I don't know, maybe. I got a book comes out next week. I'm focusing on that right now. It's with Grover Norquist debacle. I think that should be pretty good. Looking at Obama's economic policies. But I like the Freedonomics. That's probably my favorite book. You know, it goes through about 40 of my different research papers. Kind of pretty libertarian type book. But I appreciate it. Reading.
Was that a specific counter to Freakonomics?
Well, I mean, it dealt a little bit with that. You know, there are different types of economists that you have there. Levitt is somebody who kind of thinks that he knows the way the world should be, and when somebody behaves differently, he thinks that they're being dumb. And my view is that there are lots of smart people outside of academia out there in the world, believe it or not, and they have their own money at stake. And if they're doing something different than what the simple academic theories suggest, we should try to figure out maybe they have a good reason for why that's the case. So, you know, if they go and say, look, these insurance companies aren't giving a deduction for people putting low jacks on their cars. You know, you can go and say, well, we should force them to do that, which is what their approach is. And my approach is to call up the insurance companies and try to find out and try to figure out why they're not doing it. And, you know, I think it turns out that they have a pretty good reason why they're not doing it. And, you know, but there are lots of situations like that. You know, they go and argue that, you know, it's only about 5% or so of my book directly deals with their things, but, you know, they go and argue that real estate agents are like the KKK. And the thing is, they don't talk about things like reputations that real estate agents have. If they really don't care about trying to get higher prices for people's houses, are you going to go and hire them again at some point? Or are other people going to hire even the guys who buy the house when they want to sell them? Are they going to go back to the guy if they don't think that they're going to do that? And there's other stuff we can go through. You know, I'll just give you one other simple example, and then I'm going to stop. And that is, you look at, there claimed to be this lemons problem for used cars, where they claim, without really any evidence that I can tell, that the price of new cars fall by 25% as soon as you take them off the lot. So let's say that's true. Let's say I have a $20,000 car and it falls to $15,000 the minute that you take it off the lot. That's $5,000. Well, the claim is that a new buyer can't tell whether it's a problematic car or not, you know, a lemon. For less than $5,000, can you get a series of mechanics to certify it? If I can go and spend $3,000 to certify this thing, then the most of the car is going to fall is $3,000 in value. If I can certify it for $500, the most it's going to fall is $500 in value. So $5,000 tells you implicitly what you think the cost is of certifying the car. You know, we have transferable warranties. I assume it doesn't cost $5,000 to have a transferable warranty. It's already in the price of the car. And yet, you know, and I think if you look at the data, you don't see, and there's, I could go on for hours, but it's just an example. But it's just, you know, those are the two different types of economists, and I'm the type of economist that when I see people behaving in a different way than what I would think in a simple thing, my bias is to try to figure out why that's the case. And that's true throughout my work. But take one fast question.
I don't know how fast it is. You said something earlier that I found very interesting. You said that when concealed carry laws go into effect, violent crimes with guns drop even more than violent crimes without guns.
Right.
Just curious if you could expound on why that is.
Okay, I thought I mentioned that, but basically, there's a chance higher chance you're going to get shot if you're a criminal and you go and show a gun in those situations, and so it makes it more costly for them to have. And you see,
so you're saying that if you were to commit a crime and that person had a gun and you did not, you are less likely to die. That's why.
Right.
Probably quicker to shoot and defend yourself if somebody has a gun than if somebody had a knife.
You might decide to run that time.
Yeah, the victims.
I really appreciate your time here, but thanks so much.